is a podcast about all things holistic health and self-discovery with me, Ask Elizabeth, counsellor, health advocate and fundraiser. Join me as we get to know these guests and learn about how they implement health, well-being and self-care practices into their lives. Welcome to Unearthing Wellbeing with Ask Elizabeth, where our greatest wealth is health. Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of Unearthing Wellbeing. This week I had Simon Hill, also known as Plant Proof, on the podcast. He has degrees in both physiotherapy and nutrition. He is also the podcast host of Plant Proof and has recently released his first book, The Proof is in the Plants. Yet again, I hit the trifecta on guests, and boy was I nervous to have him on the show. However, within minutes, he eased my nerves and really expanded my thinking and educated me. We spoke about how Simon started on this journey of holistic health to his newly released first book, which he modestly did not mention sees 100% of proceeds donated to protect rainforests, as well as a whole lot more you just have to tune into to learn about. So here is Simon. Hey Simon, welcome to Unearthing Wellbeing. Thank you so much for coming on.
Elizabeth, pleasure to be here. I'm excited to see where this goes.
Amazing. And how are you today?
Very good. It's a beautiful morning here in Bondi where I live, and days started very nicely, so I'm feeling good.
Sounds good. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a nutritionist. I have a podcast called Plant Proof where I sit down with different nutrition scientists and dietitians and nutritionists and doctors, cardiologists, neurologists, etc., and really try to get to scientific truth. Where does the science lie when it comes to the foods we're eating in particular, and how they affect our health, and also how they affect the world around us in the case of environmental science, and with the aim of just giving the listener some really high quality information that they can sort of grab a hold of and use to make whatever changes feel right in their own lifestyle.
Sounds amazing. And yeah, I've just, as I said before to you, before we started recording, that I've been following your journey for quite some time now, and I really love learning, and this is why I really wanted to have you on. So thank you again for saying yes to this.
It's a pleasure. I love connecting with as many like-minded people as possible, and each conversation always sort of is unique and goes somewhere unique to that person and that community, that platform. So I'm looking forward to providing hopefully some value to your listeners today.
I'm sure you will. So what led you to this journey of holistic health to begin with?
Good question. So one thing I didn't state just then in terms of what I'm doing is I just published my first book, which is called The Proof is in the Plants. And the inspiration for writing that book, for studying nutrition at university, for starting the podcast, for doing what I do on social media and sharing all of this information really goes back to when I was a teenager. And I grew up in Melbourne, and so now I live in Sydney. I've crossed to the dark side, so my friends say. And I would spend a lot of time on the weekends hanging out with my dad and my brother, and on this one day in particular, it was just my dad and I, and we were spending some time in the Yarra Valley, which is a beautiful wine district outside of Melbourne in the rolling hills. It's a phenomenal place. If people haven't visited, highly suggest that you put it on your list. And we were out exploring this area, and Dad had a convertible MGB. It's an old sort of British classic car, and so we would quite often do this. And on this one particular day, we were having a great day, and we'd visited a few wineries, and we were heading back to King Lake. We had a house in country that we would often spend time at on the weekends. And so we were heading back there, and as we were driving, I could see my dad was experiencing some discomfort, and I could notice not only was he kind of rubbing and holding his shoulder, but he was also grimacing a little bit. So I inquired to see if he was okay, and he reassured me that he was, and he was experiencing a little bit of chest pain, but he downplayed it. And so we proceeded to go home, and it was into the evening, so we actually had dinner together, cooked dinner, and he reassured me everything was okay, and I headed off to bed. And a little while after, I was woken up. I heard quite a bit of noise in the kitchen area, coming from the kitchen, and I thought I better go and see how he's doing. In the back of my mind, just remembering that he had been experiencing some chest pain. And so I went out to sort of inquire and see what the noise was. And as soon as I came out and saw him, it was quite evident that everything was not okay. And by this stage, he could no longer deny that. And, I could see the fear in his facial expressions. He was out of breath. He was very pale. And he was actually making his way to call 000, which for anyone who's perhaps from outside of Australia is our version of 911. And so he actually had them on the line, and they asked if there was anyone else there who could perhaps help describe the situation and circumstances. And so that was me. I was the only other person there, and I took the phone and explained to them what my dad had been experiencing and for how long, and what he looked like right now. And they said, look, based on your geographical location being in King Lake, and this is 20 years ago now. So I was 15 then, I'm 35 now. And they said, look, the nearest hospital is a fair way away, so we need to send a helicopter. And they did that. They sent a helicopter. Yeah. So all of this was happening at a very rapid pace. Just hours earlier, we were having a great day driving around, and this came out of the blue. And not only was it unexpected in terms of just hours earlier we were having a great day, it was unexpected from a big picture point of view. So my dad was only 41, and he was not on any medications. He was not relying on the healthcare system. He had no diagnosis of any sort of chronic condition at all. So we really had no reason to see this coming. And in terms of from a physical point of view, if you looked at my dad at that period, he was living a lifestyle very representative of a young Australian father. He would exercise, moderate exercise without sort of overdoing it, anything crazy. He was definitely not obese. Maybe he was carrying a few extra kilograms, but he was, working hard, trying to make ends meet, and had a family to sort of provide for, and, eating the typical Australian diet, drinking a little bit of alcohol, but not sort of excessive in terms of society standards, an acceptable amount. I'll put it that way. And so we didn't see this coming. Anyone in our family, including my dad. And so it was all very frightening. And before I knew it, he was hooked up to oxygen, heart rate monitor. They scooped him up off the floor and put him onto the stretcher. And they said that there wasn't enough room for me in the helicopter. So I would trail by ambulance on the road and meet them at the hospital. And that felt like a very, very long road trip, because there was a lot of fear and sort of uncertainty as to what was happening. At this stage, I knew that my dad was experiencing a cardiac event because that's what they were telling us, but they weren't really sure how bad or how severe it was, and hence they needed to get him to the hospital as soon as possible. And so by the time I got to the hospital, I'd called my mother and brother, and they had come as well. And we waited and waited and waited. And then the doctor or cardiologist came out and said to us, "We've saved your father's life." And of course, that's what we were most interested in, and we were very, very grateful and most concerned about, I should say. And the next day, we sat down and had a bit of a family sort of medical meeting. They often do that before they discharge someone. And this was once my dad had been stabilized and was in the sort of condition where he could have this conversation. It wouldn't have been appropriate the night of the heart attack. And so by that time, they'd taken my dad's history, and my dad's dad, my grandfather, had also had a heart attack. And so the cardiologist, specifically speaking to my brother and I, said, my brother was 18 or 17 at the time and I was 15, said, "Look, you two boys are nearly young adults, and cardiovascular disease runs in families, and clearly it runs in your family. So you will need to be screened and be cautious about this, be conscious of it as you are entering your 20s and your 30s and 40s, etc." And that advice by itself is actually not bad advice. It's actually good advice.
Yeah.
The problem for me with that, and it may just be a result of that doctor not having sufficient time in the setting. The problem is that the conversation ended there. And fast forward 10 years, and having studied nutrition and getting very, very close with the scientific literature, becoming obsessed with reading the literature and interviewing experts around the world, it became very clear to me that while genetics do certainly play a role in cardiovascular disease, but also in type 2 diabetes, in various cancers, in dementia, in lots of different diseases that we've accepted as normal in our society. We have normalized them. While genetics can play a role, by and large, the reason these are running in our families and are so pervasive in our communities is because family members are adopting the same lifestyle, not because of genetics. And so there is some great research that's been done, various different studies, but some with identical twins who have the exact same genes, looking at what happens when one twin moves to another environment, has a different lifestyle, and is able to tease out the effect of nature versus nurture. What is the effect of genetics versus environment in terms of chronic disease development? And it's become very clear that around 80% of our health fate in terms of chronic disease is determined by our lifestyle. And so we have much more power than we're often led to believe, right? That's very empowering when we hear that. And unfortunately, from when I was 15 to my mid-20s, I kind of felt like it was in my DNA and I'd just been dealt a bad card. And that's very disempowering.
Absolutely.
And don't get me wrong, there can be a very small percentage of people who have a genetic condition, and no matter what they do, no matter how good their diet or sleep is, they are destined to experience they're destined to experience some poor health. But that is a very, very, very small percentage of people in society. For most of us, while we may have some genetic predispositions, we, through our lifestyle, can actually really determine whether those genes are expressed or not, which then ends up affecting how many years we live, but also how many years we live in good health.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, something that we all want to enjoy more of. And when we have more years in good health, we can do whatever it is we love to do for longer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that essentially discovering that is to your earlier question is what gave me planted the seed initially with my father's experience, seeing what loss of health looks like, and then unearthing this information where I felt very empowered. I immediately wanted to go and empower my friends and family. And then ultimately, I wanted to share this information with as many people as possible in the community, so that rather than waiting for pain to be the thing that causes us to change our lifestyle, let's try and be proactive. Let's try and change the way we live before that occurs, before we experience pain, or before someone in our family experiences pain. There's a lot we can do.
Yeah. I love that. And I guess the question is, how did you go about doing that?
In terms of my personal changes, or in terms of communicating that?
Both.
Okay, so for me, I guess to personally make changes, first I needed to understand, well, what parts of our lifestyle are affecting our disease risk, and what are the greatest contributors in terms of our disease risk, and then when we zoom in on those, for example, nutrition or exercise or sleep, what does the science show specifically are the types of behaviors and habits that we should try and build that will lead to good health? And so firstly, we know Global Burden of Disease study 2017, but it's repeated every couple of years, is a study that looks at risk factors for chronic disease across the world. And it's very, very clear that poor diet is the number one contributor. It is the number one contributor to poor health, to developing chronic disease, and to early loss of life. And that's when compared to smoking, to alcohol, to unsafe sex, to drinking unsanitary water, all of these other risk factors. So arguably, it is the biggest lever that we can all pull. The foods that we're putting into our mouth 3, 4, 5 times a day. And so when we look and zoom in on nutrition science, which is my area of expertise, while there is certainly not a black and white answer as to what is the single best dietary brand, and we can dig into that. And that's, unfortunately, that's what everyone wants. Everyone wants black and white.
Yeah.
And I understand. And unfortunately, absolutes sell. So we've had a lot of books sold over the past 20, 30 years with absolute sort of messaging, which is essentially trying to tell people that this is the single best way of doing something. And it's an oversimplification of the science, and what it's led to is distrust. Because if everyone is shouting an absolute and they're all different absolutes, how as a consumer can you work out what's right and who to trust?
Yeah,
that is
absolutely.
very confusing, right? So here's the thing. Science doesn't really particularly care about these dietary brands that we've made up, these labels that we've made up. And when you look at the science, although it's not black and white, it is very, very clear. And what I mean by that is there is a clear set of characteristics that define a healthy diet. And these set of characteristics are diets that are low in saturated fat, they're low in trans fats, they're low in ultra-processed foods, they're rich in fiber, and they usually are quite rich in plant protein. And those are overarching characteristics which essentially create what I call a theme. Now, here's the thing. You can tick all of those off actually with quite a few different dietary labels. You could be adopting a Mediterranean diet done well. You could actually be adopting a pescatarian diet that's done well. Actually, you could adopt a paleo diet in a sort of plant predominant manner that ticks all of those criteria, and that can lead to optimal health. It could be a vegetarian, it could be a completely whole food plant-based diet. And this makes sense from a number of for a number of reasons. It's clear when we look at the longest living populations, although there are commonalities and they tick all of those boxes. Some of them are pescatarian, some of them are vegetarian, some of them are vegan. It's not the dietary label that necessarily separates them. They're all getting most of their calories from whole plants, but some it's plant exclusive, some it's plant predominant. And if you go back from an evolutionary perspective, I think it's very clear that although in paleo circles it might be made out that our ancestors ate bacon and salami, that certainly wasn't the case. And I've interviewed a lot of evolutionary anthropologists, and what's clear is that Homo sapiens across the world, depending on their geographical location and the season, ate different foods. Yeah. And in some areas they ate more animal products and less plants. Some areas more plants and less animal products. And essentially what it shows is that as a species, one thing that actually enabled us to survive was the fact that we could adapt to a lot of different types of food. And so there is choice. And this is what I try and explain to people. There is not one single diet that is absolutely the only way to achieve optimal health. There is some choice in there. Now, sometimes that message, as I said before, because we love black and white answers, doesn't land so well with people. And it's probably not as sexy to sort of wrap up and sell in a book, but it is the scientific truth. That's ultimately where it lies. And if you look at our current diet of the average, say, Australian, and that theme that I'm talking about, how do we get from where we are to that? And essentially, it means two main things. It means cutting down or avoiding or reducing animal protein in favor of plant protein, because we're eating far too much animal protein. And that's swaps like red meat for legumes, whether it's beans or lentils or chickpeas or tofu or tempeh, and reducing the amount of ultra-processed foods that we're eating, which account for about 42% of our calories, and in turn eating more fruits and vegetables and whole grains. And if we're thinking about just those two things and nudging our diet where we can more towards that plant predominant or plant exclusive dietary pattern, whatever you feel is the sort of level of commitment that you're looking for, whatever you feel you can adhere to and sustain in the long run, then, we're all going to be upgrading our health.
Yeah. So true. And I think what resonates with me most is that you should be eating seasonally as well. You shouldn't just be eating like the same foods every single season.
Certainly, and diversity is very important. And we're fast learning how integral our microbiome is to our health. And there are a lot of gastroenterologists, particularly out there, who will say that all health starts in the gut.
Yeah.
And you know what? They are probably right. And over the last 10 years, with advances in technology and science and innovation, we've actually been able to better understand and describe the microbiome, the bacteria that reside in our gut, and better understand that relationship between us and them, and how when we look after them, they look after us in remarkable ways. And to your point on seasonal and diversity, that is key. Diversity is key, because we often think about, say, fiber as a singular, right? Yeah. Fiber is fiber, right? Well, actually, fiber in asparagus is different to the fiber in broccoli, is different to the fiber in an artichoke, is different to the fiber in a banana. There are many different types of what we call prebiotic fiber. That's the type of fiber that feeds the bacteria. So it escapes digestion, fiber escapes digestion. And then the prebiotic fiber, which is one type of fiber, of which there are many, as I was just describing, in different plant foods, they go into your colon, which is your large intestine. So they pass through the small intestine, undigested, go into the large intestine. That's where trillions of bacteria are. And they feed them. And these bacteria, they have different taste preferences like you and I. So some of them, whatever species they are, they're digging the prebiotic fiber in an onion. Whereas other guys over here, they love the prebiotic fiber in broccoli. And if we can eat with diversity, what we can do is we can keep more of them happy, and they proliferate and they grow stronger. And as they do that, they're rewarding us. They reward us by producing compounds which reduce inflammation, keep our gut lining healthier, improve our mood, improve our cardiovascular system. The benefits of having a diverse variety of these bacteria who are thriving is just absolutely immense.
Yeah, that's amazing. And like on a personal level, you have turned vegan, and like for those interested in potentially going down that route, albeit you did say that different, like it depends on what you want, whether it's vegan, paleo, Mediterranean, whatever the case. What have you found specifically, like the changes and shifts in your own well-being and health from turning vegan?
So for me, my initial decision to change the way I was eating was on health. Yeah. And for me, I have cardiovascular disease that runs in my family, which I just sort of explained. And the risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease, well, a few of them, for example, are high blood pressure and high cholesterol. Yeah. And we know that as you're eating more whole plant foods and you're lowering your animal product intake, you are reducing your saturated fat consumption, which drives up cholesterol. And you're also, it's a twofold effect because you're increasing fiber, which I just described. And one of the things that fiber also does is lowers your cholesterol levels. So you get this twofold effect where your food is moving your cholesterol profile in a favorable direction to protect you against plaque building up in your arteries, clogging those arteries and causing a heart attack or perhaps even a stroke. And so it's very clear in the evidence that the more we're moving in that direction, the better our cholesterol levels will become. So I had a real reason to explore going as sort of far as I could, and I found over a 6 to 9 month period of making very small incremental changes. I was really enjoying those changes. I was discovering new foods and new flavors, and it didn't feel like a sacrifice to me. It actually felt like an adventure. I was realizing this way of eating was not boring. It was exciting. And what really the clincher for me was I was feeling better. I was feeling more energetic. I was feeling lighter after my meals. My digestion felt better. I remember prior to that, I was a big steak lover. My friends and I grew up in gym and football culture in Melbourne. Big dinners, 6 to 10 mates. We would always sit down at a steakhouse. Squire's Loft in Melbourne was one of them. And I enjoyed the time with my friends, absolutely. But I can tell you categorically, every single time when I would leave, I would feel so sick. I was just so heavy and full, and I needed to nap. I needed to just go to sleep straight away. And that was one of the biggest things I noticed, was that when I was shifting to this higher fiber, more plant protein rich way of eating, I actually felt energetic after eating and lighter. And, that was a nice feeling. And the other interesting thing, and it is still surprising to me today, is my ability to increase my training frequency went up. I felt like I was recovering quicker. And I have to say, because I'm not someone to overplay how I feel. I didn't have like poor health and then change my diet and it was some sort of remarkable type experience. Yeah. But I will say, and I have been thinking about this a lot more recently, I'm mid-30s now, and my body feels better training than when I was in my mid-20s. I feel more mobile. I just don't have the same niggles when I'm in the gym and doing squats. I don't feel tight. I don't feel restricted. I don't get any sort of hip pain. Wow. So I just something, it's working for me in ways that I'm not sure science has yet properly explained, but it's probably to do with the very, high intake of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory molecules that you're getting when you're eating a diet with an abundance of these whole plant foods.
Oh, for sure.
So yeah, that's what that looked like for me over a sort of 6 or 9 month period. And I often say this today. I think the reason why I continued with a plant exclusive diet and still do today, it's a combination of factors. I think I could quite easily sort of sit at around that 85% plants and 15% animal products and still feel very healthy and get the health benefits. But increasingly, I've become aware of the role that our food choices are affecting the environment. And I think, deep down, when I think about what my sort of values and beliefs are, and understanding the sort of immense pain and suffering that we're putting animals through, I think, well, if I feel absolutely great without voting for that system, then I'm going to do that. And so ultimately, that's where I've landed on there. But I do like to separate it out. So like in the book, I really separated out the science to show people it doesn't have to be completely plant exclusive in terms of human health. But if we are starting to consider environmental health and all life on the planet, then I think there is a strong case for moving to a diet that's as plant exclusive as one can do and commit to and adhere to, for the longest period of time. We want life lasting changes, is what I say.
Yeah, so true. And like, I think back to what you were saying about you do what you can do. And although personally I'd love to go completely vegan, I know in my Mediterranean lifestyle and background, being Italian, at every meal and every function that I go to with extended family, there's always either meats or seafoods. And if you say no to them, they'll be like, well, that's all there is available. Like, what are you going to do? Like, why are you changing so much of your lifestyle to like this kind of diet? And sometimes they can be quite rigid in their
I think the cultural and the different generations, it makes these things difficult.
Yeah.
And I get asked that all the time. And, I don't think you have to take the mindset of all or nothing, because that often what that can do is it deters you from getting started.
Absolutely.
Maybe you do have these social events with your family, but maybe they're once a month or once a quarter or whatever. But within your 4 walls of your home, you can still make, a number of changes.
Yeah.
And then also what you can do that I find helps is, and I think can be advantageous, is some of the family and friends, perhaps if you ever get an opportunity to cook for them, again, not making a big song or dance about it, but maybe trying some recipes that are still inspired by the flavors, Mediterranean flavors or whatever, but perhaps different ingredients. And then there's some exploring that people are doing as families, and it might open some eyes to the possibilities of enjoying Mediterranean food, perhaps that has less animal products or doesn't have animal products. And so I think you can control your own environment, you can lead by example, and it's certainly not about being perfect. And I think if you take the mentality of trying to change overnight and be perfect and trying to change your whole family all at once, which often the problem with, say, documentary, you can watch a documentary and feel very inspired, and people might go out and feel compelled to do that the next day. But it's very hard to change the way your family lives their life if you're coming from a place of judgment.
Yeah.
Anyone, in fact, not many people respond well to being judged. And so if we can remember that, then anything in life, if you're wanting to inspire your family to eat healthier, for example, even though they're your family, often convincing your family to make changes is the hardest thing out there, and they're often influenced by people outside of their family, and you think, hang on, that's crazy. I gave that person information for so long. But sometimes that's necessary. But I'm a big believer of just a couple of deep breaths, leading by example, and that's probably one of the most powerful things that you can do.
Yeah, and sometimes like with that, when you're actually doing it for yourself and you're silently doing it, they notice it as well. So if you're losing weight or you're looking better, you're feeling better, they pick up on that without you actually feeding it, like spoon feeding them the information.
Yeah, and then they become curious, and then that becomes a conversation, right, rather than a lecture.
Yeah,
which is key, and then that opens the door for Elizabeth to share a recipe, and things progress from there. So
true. And going back to another topic in your book, you mentioned about like the labeling and how, like for most people, consumers get really confused about what's on packaging and stuff like that. Could you go into that in more detail?
Yeah, we have some real problems with our food environment in this country. And I said before, 42% of our calories come from ultra-processed foods. And these are largely products sold by transnational companies. Some of them you'll be familiar with, like Coca-Cola or Nestle and Mars. And these are big companies that own many different brands, not just those brands. And they control the food environment. They shape the food environment in a way where the average Australian is set up to fail. And so the easiest and the convenient option, unfortunately, in this country, in many places, is not the healthiest option. And that's a problem. If we want a healthy population, a happy population, we want to curb chronic disease and at the same time improve planetary health, what we want is the easy, the affordable, the convenient choice to be the healthiest, right? Or at least a lot healthier than today. And so food labeling, this is one aspect of the food environment. And, Australia has a health star rating system. So on the face value, Australians might think this is great. We're protected. And look, food labeling is important. The World Health Organization made it clear that it can be helpful. The problem is it's different across all countries around the world. The one in Australia, the health star rating system, has some very, very big problems. And I don't really believe it's helping people adopt a healthier diet, which is really what it's intended to be, or should be if it's applied correctly. And so I think it's important for people to understand that the health star rating system, although it was the government that led this, the food industry was heavily involved, and they lobby against it. They lobby against it, and they essentially, you end up with a health star rating system, which has made huge, a large number of concessions to keep the food industry happy. These transnational companies that employ a lot of people and have quite a big team of lobbyists putting pressure on the government. And what we've ended up with is this current system, which has some flaws, and I'll read out a few of those flaws for you. And I do discuss this in the book, but overall, the system has a 0 to 5 star rating. And 5 stars is meant to be the healthiest option, and 0 stars the least healthy. The first problem is that it's not mandatory. So if you have a product that's say 0, 1, 2, are you going to use this system? No. So what we see is a bias on shelf. Only brands that are 3, 4, or 5 tend to use the system. That's a problem in itself. Because really, if this was working well, it would be mandatory, and you should be able to compare all foods on the shelf against each other. It's very hard to compare when lots of them don't have are using the rating system and some are.
Yeah.
Now, the next biggest problem is that even the ones that are using it, that maybe are getting a 4 or 5 star, it's actually not indicative of a healthy food product. And so, how are they getting these high ratings? Well, the main thing to understand here is, well, there's two main things, but one is that the scoring system used is what's considered a compensatory system. So, how does this work? Well, they established what they call negative attributes of a food and positive attributes of a food. So, a negative attribute could be, say, saturated fat, or could be high sodium levels. A positive attribute could be protein, or it could be fiber. Now, why compensatory? What compensatory means is that, let's say, for example, your food product has a lot of saturated fat and it loses a star. It's going to downgrade the score that product gets. As a formulator for that product and that brand, I can hack the system and add some fiber, some inulin, or something like a Metamucil, psyllium husk, into the food product. And even though that saturated fat is still in there, what I will do is I will offset the negative score from that by adding the positive nutrient.
That's disgusting.
And so you can end up with products that are 4 or 5 stars that do have a number of negative attributes, but they've been offset by positive attributes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The next is that, and this is a really, really crazy thing to think about, the system does not differentiate between added sugars and natural sugars. So where does that leave us? Well, it actually means that many whole fruit products, whole foods, fruits in their whole form, would not get 5 stars. They would be getting 3, 3.5, 4. Meanwhile, you have ultra processed foods that are lower in sugar, but it's not natural, it's added sugar, plus these other negative attributes, and they add in fiber or add protein, and they end up scoring more than a piece of fruit.
Crazy.
So bottom line is, it's not actually helping people make healthier food choices. Truly, it's not. And so I think they need to make some tweaks to that system so that it works better. I think they need to really differentiate between free and added sugars. I don't think you should be able to hack the system. If it contains a lot of saturated fat or a lot of sodium, I don't think you should be able to offset that by adding any other nutrients. They are in there, and we know that you want to minimize those in your diet, irrespective of what else you're pumping into that food. And so that's going back to what I was saying at the start of this. That's just one element of the food environment that these companies are impacting, affecting, in order to drive more sales of their products. And that's the main thing we need to remember, is that these companies, their priority is not our health. Their priority is their profits.
So true. Yeah. And it actually makes me think about, at the end of the day, these companies are actually paying the government, obviously, to make sure that their products are on the shelves. Same with smokes, for instance. We know that it's not good for you, but yet it's still sold vastly around the world.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of tax income for the government there. But you're right. Like, why are cigarettes still sold? Why are ultra processed meats, which we know are considered a group 1, class 1 carcinogen, why are they still sold in service stations and at Coles and at Woolworths? We literally have the World Cancer Research Fund saying to avoid these foods, yet they're still sold in our supermarkets. There is a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also goes back and reiterates what you were saying about make sure, well, in the book you said, make sure you look at the back of your packages and read what the ingredients are. And that's what I've been doing more actively, like within over the years, because if you actually understand what the ingredients are on, like, in products, you're more likely to actually purchase them.
Definitely. And that's something that I particularly have in there when I talk about bread in part 3. And there's a tip in there, because that actually can be very confusing. I'm not sure if you've ever turned bread around, and they, on the shelf, they can all look like they're brown.
Yeah.
But a large percentage of these are actually dyed. They're dyed with a brown rice syrup, which many people are shocked to hear, but that's actually what's happening. And so, we need to eat more whole grains, for example. So whole grain bread can be a very good swap for people. Swap the refined sort of white bread for whole grain. But that in itself can be very confusing. And so you can see what's called multi-grain bread, but usually that's with refined flour. It's a trick. So there is lots of seeds on the top. Could be a 7 seed. You probably have seen these.
Yeah.
But if you check the first ingredient, it's not wholemeal flour. It doesn't say the word whole. It's refined flour. So the trick with bread, there are a few things, and I list in the book. You really want to see that first ingredient is whole. It's the word whole is used on the very first ingredient that's listed. If it's not, and your bread that you're buying, the first word just says wheat flour, for example, that is a refined food. The fiber and the micronutrients have been stripped out of that flour. And even if it's brown, you'll see in there's some ingredient like a brown rice syrup that is making it brown. So checking the first ingredient and this is one example of checking labels, checking the first ingredient. There it says whole. It could say whole wheat flour. It could say wholemeal flour. Sometimes it has a percentage next to that, like 50%, 60%. That's usually pretty good around there. But the other trick is just looking at the carbohydrates to fiber ratio. This is something that's really important. So if you look, per serve at the number of carbohydrates in that bread, and you look at the fiber, it shouldn't be any greater than a 5-to-1 ratio. So for example, if you have 20 grams of carbohydrates, you would want to see at least 4 grams of fiber. If there is less than 4 grams of fiber in that food, let's say it had 20 grams of carbs and 2 grams of fiber, that's a 10-to-1 ratio. That's too high. You know that product is heavily refined. That's why there's a lower amount of fiber in there. So they're my rules when looking at bread if you want to try and find a good option.
Interesting. Thank you for that tip. And another staple that you mention in the book is also milk, and how if you're vegan, you can actually get calcium from other sources other than cow's milk. And I think that's a point that I bookmarked personally, because my mum was diagnosed last year with osteoporosis, and by implementing 3 specific supplements, which were vitamin D, calcium, and collagen, she was able to change that diagnosis to osteopenia.
Yeah, so you speak to a couple of good points here. The first is that building strong bones is a team effort. We have reduced it to calcium alone, and calcium is important, but vitamin D in particular is huge, and a large percentage of the population are vitamin D deficient. The way that we live our lives today, we wear clothes, we're not outside as much, and so vitamin D deficiency is really, really common. If you're vitamin D deficient, vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium. So if you can consume all the calcium you want, but if your vitamin D levels are not adequate, then you'll be absorbing much less of that calcium that you're consuming. So that's really important to understand. The other key nutrients that sort of work in this team synergy are protein is very important for building strong bones, as is vitamin B12. And then from a lifestyle perspective, some resistance exercise, whether it's body weight or in a gym or whatever, is very important because ultimately structure reflects function. So the force of resistance exercise, and I say body weight because that could literally be doing step ups on a step, or it could be in the gym. There's a whole range of exercises that fall under resistance exercise, but that sends the signal to the body. Okay, I actually need to grow stronger here because there's more force going through the bone, going more load, and the body adapts. That's how the body adapts and becomes stronger, and then that reduces our risk of osteopenia, osteoporosis by improving bone mineral density. Now, when it comes to calcium, it is relatively clear in the literature that we need to consume at least 700 milligrams a day. That seems to be the point where if you're under that, then you are more likely to be at risk of developing osteopenia or osteoporosis. And when you hit that mark, it's almost like a bit of a threshold. Like you can go a lot higher than it. Doesn't seem to make much difference. What seems to make more difference is what I was speaking about before, the overall lifestyle. So how do we hit 700 milligrams? Well, as you just mentioned before, dairy is a good source of calcium. It is. And sometimes people deny that and say things about dairy, and I don't really subscribe to that. I think it's overhyped, a lot of that sort of fear mongering around dairy in many respects. But there are some good reasons for reducing our dairy consumption, particularly from a saturated fat intake point of view and from an environmental point of view. Interestingly, how's this? The countries that consume the most dairy actually have the highest fracture rates. Now,
crazy.
It's not that dairy is causing those fractures. I believe that we've teased that out and it shows that that's not the case. But these countries tend to be the countries that get the least amount of sun. So they have, back to what I was saying before about vitamin D. So what that says is dairy is a great source of calcium, but remember, it's not a panacea. If you don't have this team effort going, then you can consume as much dairy as you want. It's not going to automatically mean strong bones. From a plant-based point of view, there are, a number of different foods that provide calcium: dark leafy greens, tahini, various beans and almonds, and you can reach that 700 milligram mark with just eating whole foods. But I actually think it's a very wise idea to buy a calcium fortified plant-based milk, and they're very commonly available now. And I recommend people have about 1.5 cups of those a day, which is not a huge amount, but that will provide you with about 400 milligrams of calcium. And so when you are consuming that and then all of the food in your diet, you're easily reaching the 700 milligram mark that we want to hit. And then providing you're ticking off all those other nutrients that we spoke about, then you will be doing everything that you can to reduce your risk of developing osteopenia or osteoporosis.
It's interesting. Thank you for that. I think there is different ways to, implement those minerals and vitamins in your diet, and it goes to show that regardless of whatever stance you have in regards to this, you can hit those quotas kind of thing.
Yeah, but I will say, if you look at the evidence and you look at vegetarian and vegan populations, if they're not actually consuming enough calcium, they are at higher risk of fractures. That is in the science, it's clear. But those vegans and vegetarians who are, and they are reaching that 700 milligram mark and are ticking off all the other nutrients I mentioned, they're not, and they're getting not only do they have strong bones, but they're getting the health benefits of eating, the risk reduction of cardiovascular disease, etc. So, sometimes I see that downplayed in the sort of plant-based community, and I actually think a better way of approaching it is to say, hey, actually, there are some nutrients to focus on for good bone health. We should be aware of them, particularly postmenopausal women, because they're at higher risk of osteopenia and osteoporosis as a result of changes in hormones. You get changes in estrogen, and then that predisposes postmenopausal women to a reduction in bone mineral density. So particularly for that population, I really recommend getting across the information, setting up your diet and nutrients as your mother has, and really taking control of that to reduce your risk.
Yeah, so true. And one last point that I wanted to, I guess, discuss is like your podcast. It's amazing. I love how you're talking to different experts in the field to improve one's health. And the episode that I really loved was episode 99 with David Sinclair. And you speak about stress plants with him. Could you touch on that?
Yes, the old stress plants. I write about this
Yeah.
in chapter, I think it's chapter 8, the longevity chapter in my book. And this is very, very interesting. So there is a body of research that's looking at what are called calorie restriction or fasting mimetics is what they're called. And essentially, this comes from the idea that various levels of science, and a lot of this is in yeast and in mice and animal models. It's hard to reproduce all of this in humans for various reasons, but there is quite a bit of science suggesting that calorie restriction or fasting may improve lifespan. And the hypothesis is that it creates a micro stress. And when you put the organism underneath this little bit of stress through hunger, it activates disease resistance and longevity. Now, longevity scientists like Dr. David Sinclair, episode 99 that you mentioned, they call this hormesis. And hormesis is essentially tiny bouts of stress that cause your body to adapt and become more resilient, to become stronger. The cool thing is that calorie restriction, let's face it, that's not much fun. That's hard work. and not many of us want to commit to that in the long term, right? You could fast and you could do that sort of daily and have periods of hunger, and you could get used to that. And there are many people that do that and do that well. And people may want to consider that. But it turns out also that plants develop these sort of natural insecticides, natural pesticides. We call them phytochemicals. And they develop these in response to environmental threats from insects or from animals or from the sun exposure or from wind. And what's really important to understand here and interesting is that while all plants will produce these to protect themselves, the organic food seems to produce more of them. And the idea here is that organic foods probably have to naturally defend themselves a little bit more. They're exposed to more of these environmental threats. They're not grown in more sort of sterile, artificial environments. They're exposed more to the sun and the wind and a little bit more imperfect conditions. So they become richer in these compounds. And in turn, when humans consume them and consume these little compounds, it creates some micro stress in our bodies. Again, going back to what I said earlier about calorie restriction and fasting, this micro stress is believed to activate disease resistance and to activate longevity. And some of these compounds in stressed out plants, these calorie restriction mimetics, as they're called, are things like curcumin found in turmeric. And you probably have heard of that before, or resveratrol found in grapes and blueberries, or catechins in green tea. If you love your green tea, now you know that as you're drinking it, as you're taking a gulp of that, or sip of that, you are consuming some of these molecules that we're talking about here, these longevity activating molecules. Sulforaphane in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli or cauliflower, quercetin in berries and apples, or lignans is another molecule, another one of these in flax seeds and whole grains. And the moral of the story here, to summarize this, is that, imperfect organic style food that you see at the farmer's market or you grow at home is likely to be slightly better for us because those plants have had to produce more of these compounds to naturally defend themselves in a more threatening environment compared to a conventionally grown food that's in a much more artificial, predictable, and sort of non-threatening condition.
So interesting. Not to mention they actually taste so much better.
That's right. So, I mean, there's a little bit of food for thought. I tell people not to obsess over it, and that any fruits and vegetables and plants are better than eating ultra processed food. But certainly, where possible, if you can, try and grab some of the imperfect fruit and veg from your grocery store, or get down to the market and or grow some of your own food.
So true. I was talking to my listeners about having to refer to the Dirty Dozen if they can't afford to go organic, and trying to purchase those Dirty Dozen where you can, to kind of eliminate all the toxins and all that too.
Yeah, I think, and I wrote about this in my book, and my message was about buying organic where possible.
Yeah.
But I think it's also kind of important to, I guess, be fair to the science. I don't want to scare people off of conventional fruit and veg as well.
Yeah.
Although they might contain more pesticides, the science to date, and it is limited, but there are a couple of big studies, suggest from a cancer point of view, there is not really any difference between organic and conventional, except for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It seems that there is an advantage to consuming organic food for that particular cancer, but it is very hard to study this. It's very hard to study the effects of conventional versus organic in a very highly accurate way when we're talking about exposure, different levels of exposure, what's safe, what's not. We're talking about over what period, a long period of time, following people. So I don't know that science has fully teased all of that out. But I think when you look at the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma risk and there being a slight advantage to organic food, and you look at the fact that organic food, definitely we know it's higher in antioxidants. There are studies showing that. I think there is a case for erring on the side of caution where you can. Again, remembering in the back of your mind that conventional fruit and veg still will be dramatically better for your health than eating ultra processed food.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And I'm not in the financial position to go fully organic anyway. So it's just just something to consider at the end of the day. So yeah.
Definitely. I mean, most of the studies out there showing benefits of fruit and veg, they are not these big studies looking at populations. They're not looking at organic consumption. It's looking at standard fruit and vegetable consumption, and time again, it shows clear benefit. So given that 95% of Australians are failing to eat enough fruit and veg, just start where you can.
Exactly. So true. And wrapping up, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So, favorite food to make?
Ooh, right now, I'm enjoying, I have a meal plan on my website. It's actually complimentary if anyone wants it. And in there, I have a soba noodle salad with tofu and coriander and Asian dressing, Asian flavors. So that's kind of my favorite thing to have. I had that last night.
Beautiful. And where is your happy place?
I've really set up my home environment to be my happy place. So I will definitely say that. But also anytime I'm sort of by the beach, at the ocean, sea breeze, salt, sun, I definitely feel at home there.
Love that. And what is something that people don't know about you?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess after my first year of physiotherapy, that was the first degree I did, I started having doubts about whether this was the right career for me to pursue. And actually, applied to do law science at Monash University, and they accepted me. And I went to orientation week, and I had this big idea in my head. I would do this law science double degree, and I would become a patent lawyer for pharmaceutical companies.
Mm.
And after orientation, and I was handed a stack of reading, as any law student would know, and I was given my library card, I realized that I'm a very visual learner. And that was why I initially had gone into science, and why I love science, studying anatomy and physiotherapy, and looking at the structure of molecules. I found that to be a much more pleasurable form of learning for me personally. So I went back and begged my physiotherapy course to let me back in. And thankfully, that the second year had already started, and they let me back in. And if I didn't do that, and I had have gone down that route of law science, I could be working for Pfizer or Johnson and Johnson today.
Oh my God, that's crazy. All right. So next question: what are your self-care tips and tricks?
Okay. Keep it simple. Sleep routine. Make sure that you have your routine down pat. That's not just how long you're sleeping for, but that's what you're doing in the hours before you're going to bed. It's how dark your room is, how cool your room is. For me, that's not eating a couple of hours before bed. It's dimming the lights. It's I made sure that my curtains and blinds are blocking out light properly. And I try and keep the room relatively cool, which I find is better for a deeper sleep and recovery. Hydration, easy to forget the basics. Water is probably the most underrated superfood out there. So if you're not getting the basics right, then there's little point focusing on all the the less important things that are perhaps often more hyped. And then get those two things right: sleep, hydration. For me, the next is 5 minutes at least per day of complete silence to sit and to think, because, and I think everyone will relate to this. We're constantly now just always engaged and distracted by something, whether it's our phone or Netflix. And rarely, I found personally, do I get the time to sort of just take some inventory and work out how I'm feeling, connect with the breath, and to just quieten some of that noise down. So that would be my 3 self-care tips and tricks. And I didn't include food in there because I felt like that would be the easy answer.
Amazing. And that leads me to my last question that I ask everyone. For someone wanting to unearth their well-being, and you might have answered these already, what would be your 3 tips?
Unearth their well-being. It starts with awareness, I feel. So I mentioned take inventory. That is a time where you quieten everything. And look, it can be difficult if you're a young mom and you've got busy family, kids, trying to do everything. But if you can find the space for yourself to get 5-10 minutes to get quiet, to just think, and to tap into how you're feeling and what's important to you, you can then work out what goals maybe you have, and how you'd like to change things in your life. And then the next step would be around breaking those goals down. Goals are great, but here's the thing. If you look at people that are successful and not, usually it's not they had different goals. Their goals are usually the same. If you look at a professional golfer, their goals, all of them have a goal to win. They don't all win. So goals don't differentiate. Usually that's not the differentiation between someone who's successful and not. Usually it's how can they break those goals down into actionable changes in habit. So this is where you create a system. If you have whatever that goal may be, you need to break that down, and you need to have very small changes and understand that tiny habits played out over a long time will have a huge impact. So one of my biggest tips for anyone listening, and if they're thinking about being inspired to change their diet or sleep or anything, is to go slow, break it down, and realize that if you stack changes week on week and week, slowly, when you look back in a year, year and a half, you will have made huge difference to your lifestyle, but it will feel relatively effortless as opposed to trying to make massive changes overnight that are unsustainable. And when done in that manner, it's very hard to shift them from a very conscious to an unconscious behavior. And so if you start small and break it down, the idea is these actions go from conscious to unconscious and they become habits. So that's the second thing. And then I'd probably say, which ties into that, is play the long game. We gain weight over 10 to 12 years, but we want to get rid of it in a week.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. We have to realize that shifting to a healthy lifestyle isn't going to happen overnight, and also that it's not going to be a linear process. You will have ups and downs. That's expected. That is normal. The key is that when you're down, don't let that derail you. Understand that's a normal part of your progression. Having the down and having the setback is part of the progression. Focused on what is the next action you're going to make. And if you consistently do that, while it won't be a linear, straight up line of progression, you will be making progress over the long term.
Love that. Amazing. Oh my God. I can't believe we've just been chatting for like over an hour and I just want to keep going. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And the last thing I want to say is for those wanting to reach out or follow you or purchase a book, where can they find you?
Sure. So if they want to listen to more of me, they might be sick of me now. They can come and listen to the Plant Proof podcast. So that's where I sit down with different experts from around the world, like Dr. David Sinclair that you mentioned before. They can jump on social media. I'm most active on Instagram, so @plant_proof. I have a website, plantproof.com. On there, you can read blogs on various aspects of nutrition. You can download that free complimentary meal plan that I mentioned before. And if you want to grab a copy of my book, it's called The Proof is in the Plants. And I do have a page on the website that you can sort of click through to retailers, but just speaking generally, it's available at every bookstore in Australia and online bookstores as well.
Amazing. And I can't wait to read mine. I've purchased it. And yeah, for those who are interested, just hit Simon up. Well, I hope you have a great day and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I've loved this. Great questions. So appreciate you having me on the show and always happy to come back and do it again.
I'll hold you up on that. Don't worry. Wow. Simon Hill, ladies and gents. I hope you are mentally, or better yet, physically jotting down all the good stuff Simon was sharing. I kid you not, I finished recording wanting to look up where to enroll for a nutrition course. His passion was infectious. If you loved the episode as much as I enjoyed chatting with Simon, reach out to both of us and let us know. To ensure Ask Elizabeth and Unearthing Wellbeing continues to grow, please subscribe and rate the podcast. Feel free to also share and tag us on your socials. I hope you have a lovely day. Be safe and be kind. Take care.